I still remember the smell of that morning. Jasmine. My mother had planted a small bush in the backyard when we first arrived in the United States, as if that one flower could hold together everything we had left behind in Morocco. And every morning, before Fajr, before my father even woke for the first prayer of the day, I would open my bedroom window and just stand there, breathing it in. It was the only moment I felt, I don't know, whole. Just me and that scent and the sky still purple outside. I was 14 years old, and I didn't know that morning would be the last one in which I was still a child. My father came into the kitchen while I was helping my mother with breakfast. I remember the sound of his footsteps on the tile. He always walked with this kind of quiet authority, like each step was deliberate, like the ground itself was supposed to take notice. He sat down at the head of the table, folded his hands, and looked at me in a way that made my stomach drop before he said a single word. My mother kept her back to us, stirring something on the stove. The smell of cumin filled the room. She already knew. I could tell by the way her shoulders were pulled up toward her ears. "Yasmin," he said. Just my name. That was all he needed. He told me that a good man had been found. A man from a family my father respected, originally from Fez, now living in New Jersey. He was 26 years old. He had a job. He was devout. He would take care of me. My father said all of this the way he recited certain passages, with a tone that was not cruel, but that left absolutely no room for another voice in the conversation. I stood there holding a dish towel, and I felt the floor tilt underneath me. I was 14. I still had a book report due on Friday. Before I go any further, if this story is already touching something in you, if something in you recognizes this feeling of being trapped inside a life that was chosen for you, please take a second and subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the people whose stories might finally reach someone who needs them. Now let me keep going, because what happened next changed everything. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Not right there in that kitchen with the cumin smell and my mother's stiff shoulders and my father's folded hands. I had been raised to be quiet, and I was quiet. I said yes, Baba, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, and I went back to my room, and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I stared at the wall for what felt like an hour. There was a small crack in the plaster near the window, shaped almost like a river on a map. I had stared at that crack 1,000 times doing homework, daydreaming, falling asleep. That day I stared at it and thought, I cannot do this. I cannot. I want you to understand who I was before I tell you what I did. I was not a rebellious girl. I was not the kind of teenager who snuck out or talked back or tested limits. I had been raised inside a world with very clear walls, and for most of my life I had not questioned those walls because I had not yet pressed my hands against them hard enough to feel how solid they were. My father was an imam. Not a small, quiet imam in a little storefront mosque. He was respected. People drove from 3 counties away to hear him speak on Fridays. Families brought their disputes to him. Young men came to him for guidance. In our community, his word was not quite law, but it was the next closest thing. And my mother was a good woman. I want to be careful how I say this because I love her, and I have spent 35 years learning to understand her rather than resent her. She was a woman who had also been shaped by the same walls, who had learned to find her dignity within them, who genuinely believed that what was being arranged for me was the best possible life a girl like me could have. She wasn't performing obedience. She had internalized it so completely that it had become her. That is its own kind of tragedy, and I didn't understand it until I was much older. I want to tell you about my father, before he was my obstacle, before he became the figure at the kitchen table. Because he was someone else first, and that someone else mattered. My father was born in a small city outside of Marrakesh, the son of a man who had memorized the entire Quran by the time he was 12 years old. That kind of lineage carries weight. He grew up surrounded by the sound of recitation. It was the texture of his childhood, the way Jasmine was the texture of mine. He studied for years, traveled to Fez to learn at one of the oldest universities in the world, and came back with a depth of knowledge that made him respected in every room he entered. He had a gift for making complex things clear. People came to him with their hard questions, and he answered them not by dismissing the difficulty, but by sitting inside it with them. I know this because I saw it happen many times when I was a child. He was a patient man in that way, genuinely patient. It was one of the most confusing things about him, that he could be so generous with strangers in their confusion and so ungenerous with his own daughter in hers. But that is the nature of blind spots. You don't see them because they are behind you. We had come to the United States when I was 4 years old. My father had been invited to lead a growing mosque in a mid-sized city in New Jersey, a community of Moroccan and North African immigrants who needed someone to anchor them spiritually in a country that felt foreign and sometimes hostile. I grew up speaking Arabic at home and English at school, living in two worlds that rarely touched each other. At school I was quiet, studious, the girl who always had her homework done, who ate lunch quickly and read during the free period. I didn't have close friends, not really. There was a girl named Caitlin who was kind to me in the way that some people are kind to someone they sense is lonely, genuine but cautious, like she didn't quite know how to reach me through the glass. At home, I was a different kind of quiet, a performing quiet. I helped with meals, I attended every prayer, I memorized the surahs my father assigned, I wore what I was told to wear, I went where I was told to go. I was good at it. And for a long time, being good at it felt like enough. It felt like belonging. There is something seductive about performing a role well enough that you almost forget it is a performance. The movements become automatic. The right words come without effort. You receive approval, and approval feels like warmth, and warmth feels like love. And for a long time, you don't examine the difference too closely because the examining itself feels dangerous. Like pulling at a thread that might unravel something you need in order to keep standing. But something had been shifting in me for about a year before that morning in the kitchen. I can't point to one moment. It was more like, you know how sometimes you're in a room and the light changes so gradually that you don't notice until suddenly you realize you can't see the corners anymore. It was like that. I had started to have questions I couldn't ask. Not theological questions, not yet, just human ones. Questions like, what do I want? What do I think? Not what am I supposed to think? Is there a version of me that exists outside of what this family, this community, this tradition needs me to be? I hadn't answered any of those questions yet. I was 14. I was just beginning to understand that they existed. And then my father sat down at that kitchen table, and suddenly the timeline of my life was being decided without me, and the questions turned into something much more urgent than curiosity. I spent 3 days saying nothing. 3 days of meals and prayers and homework and the crack in the plaster. 3 days of setting plates on the table and washing them afterward and folding laundry and pretending that the inside of my chest wasn't a hurricane. At night, I'd lie in the dark and I'd listen to the sounds of the house settling, the radiator ticking against the cold, the distant sound of my father's voice through the wall as he read his evening prayers. His voice in those prayers was different from his daytime voice. It was softer, more liquid, something almost tender in it. I used to fall asleep to that sound when I was very small and feel completely safe. Now I lay there listening to it and felt something close to grief. On the third night, I lay in bed and I made a decision that terrified me more than anything I had ever done. I was going to leave. I didn't know where. I didn't know how. I just knew I could not stay. The church was not a plan. I want to be honest about that because I've heard my own story told back to me in ways that make it sound like I had this clear, guided sense of direction. Like I was already being drawn to Jesus and I just needed a reason to walk through the door. That is not what happened. What happened is that I walked out of my house on a Saturday morning while my father was at the mosque for a study session, with $32 in my pocket and a backpack with 2 changes of clothes and my passport, which I had taken from the drawer in my parents' room the night before with shaking hands. And I walked. I just walked. I ended up on a street I didn't know well, about 2 miles from our house. My feet hurt. It was October and colder than I'd dressed for, and I could feel the chill coming up through the thin soles of my shoes. I hadn't eaten. I didn't know what I was doing. I walked past a gas station, a laundromat, a hair salon with a hand-painted sign. And then I walked past a church. It was not a grand church. It was a small, slightly tired-looking building with white paint peeling at the corners and a sign out front with one of those movable letterboards. The message on it that week said, "You are not too broken to be loved." I stopped walking. I stood on that sidewalk and I read those words, and something happened in my chest that I still don't have a perfect word for. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like recognition. Like something in me went, that is the thing I needed to hear. I went inside. The interior smelled like old wood and candle wax, and it was almost empty on a Saturday morning, just a woman in her 60s arranging flowers near the altar, and a man vacuuming a side aisle who turned off the machine when he heard the door. The woman looked up at me. She had white hair pulled back loosely and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at me the way almost no one had ever looked at me, like I was simply a person who had walked in with no assumptions and no agenda, just open. "Can I help you, honey?" she said. I hadn't planned what to say. I stood there in the doorway with the cold air coming in behind me and my backpack on my shoulders, and I said, "I don't know. I think I'm in trouble." Her name was Dorothy. She sat me down in a pew and she brought me a cup of coffee from somewhere in the back. It was weak and too sweet, and it was the best thing I had ever tasted in my life. And she listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look frightened or judgmental or eager. She just listened, and I told her everything. The kitchen table, my father's voice, the man from New Jersey, the crack in the plaster, the $32, all of it. I talked for maybe 20 minutes, and she sat next to me the whole time with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on my face, and she didn't once look at her watch or toward the door or anywhere else. She was fully there. I didn't have a word for what that felt like. I had never experienced it before in exactly that way. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were right to come somewhere safe." She called a woman named Pastor Linda who arrived within the hour, and Pastor Linda called a social worker. And by that evening, I was in a temporary placement with a foster family across town, and my life had split in two. Everything before that Saturday and everything after. I want to pause here for just a second and ask you something real. Where are you watching this from right now? What city, what country, what corner of the world are you sitting in? Because I think about that sometimes. How many people are watching something like this in a place where they feel completely alone, where they think no one could possibly understand what they're carrying? I was that person. I was that 14-year-old girl in a cold church doorway thinking I was the only one. You are not the only one. Write your city in the comments. Just that. Let's see how many of us there are. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, and I say that having lived through things that came later that were objectively more painful in certain ways. But there is a specific kind of pain that comes from being 14 and knowing that your father, a man you love, a man you have tried your whole life to make proud, is somewhere across town feeling shamed and furious and grieving, and that you are the cause. That pain is particular. It has a texture. It feels like something tearing very slowly. My father did not try to bring me home by force. I think part of me expected that, feared it, had half prepared for it. Instead, what happened was silence. Through the social worker, through the legal channels that had been opened, there was communication, cold, formal, mediated. He did not contest the placement. He cooperated with the authorities. And then, for a very long time, he simply did not speak to me at all. My mother called once, about 6 weeks after I left. I could hear her crying before she said a word. She said, "Yasmin, your father's heart is broken." I said, "Mama, so is mine." And then I said something I had never said to her before, had never allowed myself to say. I said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't live a life I didn't choose. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know, Habibti." Just that. And then she said she had to go. And the line went quiet. And I sat in the foster family's kitchen holding the phone, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. The foster family was kind. They were a Black Christian family, the Washingtons, and they had been fostering children for 11 years. Their house was warm in the specific way that houses become warm when they have held a lot of people over a long time. A little worn, a little layered, smelling of cooking and fabric softener, and the particular warmth of people who are used to making room. Mrs. Washington made food like it was an act of worship, and maybe it was. Mr. Washington was a quiet man who said things rarely but always worth hearing. They didn't try to convert me. I want to say that clearly because I know it matters. They were deeply faithful people and they didn't hide it, but they also didn't push. They prayed before meals, and I sat with my hands in my lap, and they never made me feel like my silence was a problem. Mrs. Washington once said to me, "Baby, God can find you wherever you are. You don't have to go looking all at once." But I was curious. I won't pretend I wasn't. I had grown up in a home where faith was everything, the structure, the rhythm, the air itself. And now I was living in a different version of that, and I couldn't help but observe it. I started going to church with them on Sundays. Not because anyone asked me to, just because I wanted to see. I wanted to understand what it was that made Dorothy sit in that sanctuary on a Saturday morning arranging flowers like it was the most natural thing in the world. What it was that made the sign say what it said. The first few Sundays, I just sat and watched. The singing was the first thing that broke something open in me. I had grown up with the call to prayer, with the recitation of Quranic verses, with a kind of beauty that was formal and vertical, meaning it pointed upward, always, and asked you to be small in the right way before something enormous. This was different. This music came from somewhere horizontal as well, from the chests of people around me, and it moved through the room like something alive, and it didn't ask me to be small. It asked me to be present. I didn't know how to cry in church yet, but I wanted to. There was one Sunday, I think it was my third or fourth, when the congregation sang something I didn't know, a hymn I'd never heard, and the woman sitting 2 rows ahead of me had a voice that was not technically perfect, but was absolutely unguarded, and she sang with her eyes closed and her chin slightly lifted. And I watched her, and I thought, she is not performing this. She is not doing this for anyone in this room. She is somewhere else entirely. I had never seen an adult look that free. It unsettled me in the best possible way. I thought about her for days afterward. I started reading. Mrs. Washington had a Bible on the coffee table, the kind that's been read so many times the spine is soft and certain pages fall open by themselves. I started picking it up in the evenings, tentatively at first, like I wasn't sure I was allowed. I read the Psalms first because they felt the most like what I knew. Poetry, prayer, the voice of a person speaking directly to God with everything they had, including desperation. My God, why have you forsaken me? I read that and I thought, whoever wrote this knew something true. Whoever wrote this had been in a Saturday morning doorway moment and they had written it down. Then I read the Gospels and I read about Jesus. I have to be careful here because I know that what I'm about to say will mean different things to different people listening to this, and I want to say it right. I came to Jesus not through argument, not through someone sitting me down and presenting a theological case. I came to him through reading his words, his actual words, the things he said to people, and feeling, in a way I couldn't explain and didn't try to explain, that he was telling the truth, not a truth, the truth. There is a difference, and I felt the difference in my body before I understood it in my mind. He talked to women when no one else did. He talked to the outsiders, the displaced, the ones the system had decided were not worth the conversation. He touched people that the religious authorities of his time had declared untouchable. And he said things like, "The truth will set you free." He said things like, "I am the way, not a way, the way." I read that, and I thought about my father's kitchen table and the crack in the plaster and the sign outside the church and Dorothy's cup of too sweet coffee, and something in me shifted on its axis and never shifted back. I gave my life to Jesus on a Tuesday night in February in the Washington's living room, with Mrs. Washington holding my hand and Mr. Washington sitting in his armchair, with his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly. I didn't plan it. Mrs. Washington had asked me if I wanted to pray together, and I said yes, and she started to pray. And somewhere in the middle of her prayer, I started to cry in a way I hadn't cried since I was very small. The kind of crying that comes from a place in you that doesn't have a name, and I said out loud. I just said it. It came out of me. "Jesus, I believe you. I believe you're real. I want to follow you." That was it. That was the whole thing. The room smelled like the candle Mrs. Washington always burned in the evening, something warm and faintly vanilla, and outside the window the street was quiet, and I felt something lift off me that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. But I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is what this kind of story owes the people listening. That moment was real, and it was the most important moment of my life. And it was also the beginning of a very long road that was often painful and confusing, and nothing like the clean arc that conversion stories sometimes get packaged into. Following Jesus did not fix my life overnight. It did not reunite my family. It did not erase the grief. It gave me something to stand on, something true and solid, and that never moved even when everything else did. But standing on solid ground while everything around you is shifting is still difficult. It just means you don't fall. The next several years, I navigated the American system as a young woman with a complex immigration status, a family I couldn't contact, and a new faith that put me at odds with the community I'd grown up in. The social workers helped me. Pastor Linda became a constant in my life. She was a small, intense woman with short gray hair and a directness that I found deeply comforting after years of things being communicated sideways and underneath. She said what she meant. She also pushed me in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable. "Yasmin, you have a mind," she said to me once, when I was 17 and thinking of not applying to college. "God gave you that mind for a reason, and you don't get to waste it out of timidity." I applied to 3 schools. I got into 2. College was its own kind of revelation. I studied social work because I wanted to spend my life doing what Dorothy had done for me in that church on a Saturday morning. Just being present, just listening, just helping people find somewhere safe. I found a small Christian campus ministry that became my community, a collection of people from radically different backgrounds who were all, in their various ways, trying to figure out how to follow Jesus in the middle of ordinary and sometimes chaotic life. I was not the only one who had come to faith sideways, through a back door, through a crisis. That mattered to me more than I can say. There was a young man in that ministry named Daniel who became one of my closest friends for the better part of a decade. He had grown up in a very religious household too, a different tradition entirely, evangelical and strict in its own ways. And he had his own complicated relationship with the distance between the faith he'd inherited and the faith he was trying to build for himself. We used to sit in the campus dining hall until they almost turned the lights off on us, drinking terrible coffee from paper cups and talking about things we couldn't talk about anywhere else. What does it mean to believe something? How do you know when the thing you trust is actually trustworthy? Is there a difference between the institution and the truth it claims to carry? He asked good questions. Jesus was patient with both of us. I won't tell you the years were easy, because they weren't. I graduated and moved to Philadelphia for a job with a child welfare organization, and for the first year I barely slept. I was 23 years old, and I was sitting across from parents who had hurt their children in ways that made me want to leave the room. And I was sitting with children who looked at me from behind their eyes like they were looking from very far away. And I carried all of it home on the subway at night, and I sat with it in my apartment, and I asked Jesus what I was supposed to do with it. There were no clean answers. There never are in that kind of work. But there was something, a kind of steadiness underneath the weight, something that kept me upright even when I felt crushed. I think that is what grace actually looks like in practice. Not the removal of difficulty, but the presence of something that makes the difficulty bearable. There were seasons of profound loneliness. There were relationships that didn't work, faith communities that disappointed me, moments of doubt that lasted months. There was a period in my late 20s when I was so exhausted by the distance from my family that I went through a kind of numbness that felt almost like grief, because it was grief. I was grieving people who were still alive. I was grieving the possibility of a reconciliation I was starting to believe might never come. I stopped going to church for about 4 months during that period. I didn't stop believing. It wasn't that, exactly. But I was so tired of carrying so much inside a community that didn't know the whole of me, that knew Yasmin the social worker, Yasmin who was reliable and showed up and brought food to people in crisis, but didn't know the Yasmin who still sometimes woke in the night reaching for a version of her family that no longer existed. I sat in my apartment on Sunday mornings and read and prayed on my own and had some of the most honest conversations with God I had ever had, because there was no one watching and I didn't have to manage anyone else's experience of my pain. I told God I was angry. I told him that $32 and a backpack had been a very high price for freedom, and I was still paying it. I told him that I needed him to be real, not as a concept, not as a framework for living, but actually real, actually present in the room with me on a Sunday morning in Philadelphia when I was 28 years old and my chest hurt. And he was. That's the only way I know how to say it. He was. I prayed about my father every day, every single day for years. Not always in formal, structured prayer, sometimes just in the space between one moment and the next, a kind of internal lifting of his name toward whatever was listening. God, my Father, God. I didn't pray for him to convert. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be dishonest to make this story neater than it was. I prayed for him to be well. I prayed for some kind of peace between us, whatever shape that could take. I prayed that he knew I still loved him, that the leaving had not been a rejection of him as a person, but a refusal of something being done to me. Whether he ever received any of that through whatever invisible channel prayer operates on, I don't know. But I sent it anyway every day for decades. My mother and I began talking again when I was in my mid-20s. Carefully at first, like two people stepping onto ice they're not sure will hold. She called me on my birthday. I hadn't heard from her in almost 4 years. And she said, "I think about you every day, Yasmin." I said, "I think about you too, Mama." We didn't talk about my father. We didn't talk about faith. We talked about small things, what I was studying, whether I was eating well, what the weather was like, where I was. It was the most important conversation I had ever had. Over the next several years, my mother and I rebuilt something. It was not what we had before. It couldn't be. But it was real and tender and ours. She came to visit me once, just her, when I was 29 and living in my first apartment in Philadelphia. It was a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building with tall windows that let in a lot of light in the mornings and creaky floors that my downstairs neighbor had stopped complaining about. She stood in my living room and looked at the small wooden cross I had on the wall, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. I held my breath. Then she said very quietly, "You seem at peace, Habibti." And I said, "I am, Mama. I really am." She touched the cross with one finger, very lightly, and then she turned and asked if I had anything to eat, and I went to make her tea. We sat together at my small kitchen table and ate the pastries she had brought from a Moroccan bakery she'd found 2 towns over. They were called chabakia, fried dough coiled in honey and sesame seeds, and the smell of them hit me in the throat in a way I wasn't prepared for. The smell of my childhood, the smell of every Eid morning I had ever known. I had to look out the window for a second to collect myself. My mother pretended not to notice, which was its own kind of tenderness. Outside the window, the October light was golden, and she told me small stories about people I'd known as a child, neighbors and relatives, and the families from the mosque, told in that particular way she had of making the ordinary sound like something worth preserving. She told me about the butcher on our old street who had retired and whose son had taken over the shop and was doing it all wrong, according to everyone in the neighborhood. She told me about a wedding she had attended the month before, how the bride had been so nervous she'd dropped her bouquet twice walking down the aisle. Small things. Real things. And for a few hours the distance between us felt almost normal, almost like something that could be lived with. When she left, she held me for a long time at the door, and I could feel her hands pressing against my back like she was memorizing something. I stood in the hallway after she was gone, and I stood there for a while, and I let myself feel the fullness of what had just happened. The grief and the gratitude all tangled together, inseparable, which is how love usually works when it's real. My father. Where do I even begin with my father? He was not a villain. I need you to hear me say that, because I know how this story can be told, and I don't want to tell it that way. He was a man who had been formed, completely and from childhood, inside a world with its own logic, its own sense of love, its own understanding of what it meant to protect someone. When he arranged that marriage, he believed he was doing the most loving thing a father could do. He believed he was securing my future. He believed that the traditions he was upholding were not a cage, but a shelter. He was wrong, not because the tradition was his, but because he applied it to a person without asking that person. But being wrong in that way, from inside that understanding, is different from being malicious. I spent a long time learning to hold both of those things at once. I saw him twice in the first 30 years after I left. Once when my mother organized a very brief, very tense meeting when I was in my early 30s. We sat across a table from each other in a restaurant and spoke for maybe 45 minutes, and neither of us said anything true. He was polite and formal and looked at me like he was looking at something he didn't quite recognize but was trying to memorize. I was the same with him. We shook hands when we said goodbye. I cried in my car for an hour. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time afterward. I remember the windows fogging up slightly from the inside, and the sound of traffic on the road nearby, and a grocery bag blowing across the lot in the wind. I had brought no expectations into that meeting, or so I'd told myself. And yet, I sat there understanding that I had been hoping for something I wasn't able to name, and it hadn't happened, and I needed to make room for that without letting it harden into bitterness. I prayed in the car. Not elegant prayer, not the kind you'd write down. Just, God, I don't know how to do this. Help me be a person who can keep loving someone across a distance like this. Help me not to close. That was all, and then I drove home. The second time was at my mother's funeral, when I was 41. That day, I don't want to describe in detail because it belongs to her, and I'm not ready to share all of it. But I will tell you that my father and I stood side by side at the graveside. And at some point, his hand found mine, and we held on to each other without speaking. And I understood something in that moment that I had been turning over for years. That grief is a language that doesn't require translation. Whatever had been broken between us, we were standing in the same loss. We were her children in the same way, regardless of everything. After my mother died, something shifted between my father and me. Slowly. Over years. He began calling me. Not often, once a month or so, sometimes less. We talked about her at first, always about her. The small things she did, the particular way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, the food she made on Fridays, the sound of her moving through the kitchen in the mornings. He talked about her with a tenderness I had not often heard from him. Not that he hadn't loved her, he had loved her completely. But this was grief loosening something in him, opening registers he had kept closed. Then we began, gradually, to talk about other things. He asked about my work. I told him about the families I was helping, the children I sat with, the work of listening that had become my whole life. He listened. He asked questions. There was something in his voice in those calls, a kind of searching that I hadn't heard before, or maybe hadn't been listening for. He was in his early 80s, and his health had been declining for about 3 years when he called me one evening in October. The leaves outside my window were the color of fire, orange and red, and a particular gold that seems too bright to be natural. I remember watching them move in the wind while his voice came through the phone. "Yasmin," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Of course, Baba," I said. My heart was doing something strange. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about Jesus." I sat down. I don't know if I had ever moved to a chair so slowly in my life, like I was afraid to break the moment, like sudden movement might cause it to dissolve. I sat down and I looked at the burning leaves outside and I said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he said, "from the beginning." I talked to him for 3 hours that night. I told him everything, not as a theological argument, not as a daughter trying to win a debate she had been losing for 35 years. I just told him. I told him about the sign on the church and what it said. I told him about Dorothy and the too sweet coffee. I told him about reading the Psalms by myself in the Washington's living room. I told him about the Tuesday night in February and Mrs. Washington's hand and the vanilla candle and the thing that lifted off me that I still didn't have a name for. I told him what Jesus had said about the outsiders and the untouchable ones and the truth that sets you free. I talked, and sometimes he was quiet, and sometimes he asked something, and I answered, and then kept going. And I told him about the woman at the well. I don't know why that was the story I kept coming back to, but I told him about this woman who had been defined entirely by her circumstances, by what had happened to her and what people had decided about her because of it, and how Jesus went out of his way to sit with her, specifically, deliberately, out of his way. His disciples were surprised by it, and he talked to her like she was a full human being, like her inner life mattered, like she had something to offer. And he told her the truth about herself, not cruelly, but clearly, honestly. And she received it and went back to her village and told everyone. She became, in a very real sense, the first evangelist of that region. This woman who had been a scandal, who had been a kind of social exile. Jesus looked at her and saw something no one else was choosing to see. I told my father that story, and then I was quiet, and I waited. At the end, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I did you a wrong, Yasmin, when you were a child. I did you a wrong, and I have known it for a long time, and I did not know how to say it." I was crying by then. I said, "Baba," he said, "let me finish." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like a wall coming down one stone at a time. I believed I was right, and I believed that belief made what I did right. I understand now that those are not the same thing, and I am sorry. I am asking you to forgive me. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, not because the wound had stopped being a wound, but because I had been following someone for 35 years who had shown me, by example and by everything he said and did, that forgiveness is not something you offer when the hurt is over. It's something you offer in the middle of the hurt, and then you keep offering it, and slowly, over time, it becomes something other than effort. It becomes who you are. My father asked to speak with a pastor. Not to convert, he was careful to say. He didn't know yet. He was an old man, and he had to be honest about what he didn't know. But he wanted to talk. He wanted to ask questions and have someone answer them seriously. I connected him with a pastor I trusted, a man named Samuel, who had been a friend of mine for many years, patient and learned and genuinely respectful of people coming from other traditions. They began talking by phone once a week. I didn't ask my father about those conversations, and he didn't always volunteer the details, but occasionally he would say something, a sentence, a reflection, that told me something was happening in him. He said once, "That man Jesus, he was not afraid of hard questions." Another time he said, "I am reading about the woman at the well. She was like you, Yasmin, someone the system had already decided about." I couldn't speak for a moment when he said that. I just said, "Yes, Baba, she was." One evening he called me and said he had been reading the Sermon on the Mount for the third time in a week. He said, "This man does not speak like someone who is trying to build a system. He speaks like someone who knows something the rest of us don't." I said, "Yes, that's exactly it." He was quiet, and then he said, "It is like listening to water. You cannot argue with water. You can only decide whether you are thirsty." I sat with those words for a long time after we hung up. I still sit with them sometimes. My father gave his life to Jesus 4 months before he died. He was 83 years old, and he was in his apartment in New Jersey, the same city, remarkably, where the man from Fez had lived, the man I had never met, the man whose existence had set everything in motion all those decades ago. My father was in his apartment, and Pastor Samuel was with him, and I was on the phone, and my father said in Arabic, with a voice that sounded both very old and somehow very young, "I believe Jesus is the truth. I want to follow him." I was sitting at my kitchen table when he said those words, the same table where I drink my coffee in the mornings, where I have my quiet time, where sometimes I open the window to catch whatever is blooming outside. There are no jasmine bushes near my apartment in Philadelphia, but that morning I could have sworn I smelled it. He died on a Friday, in the early morning, before the sun was fully up. I flew to New Jersey, and I sat with him in the last hours, and I held his hand, which was thin and dry and very warm, and I talked to him even when I wasn't sure he could hear me anymore. I told him about the jasmines Mama used to grow. I told him I would see him again. I told him that what Jesus had said about the Father's house, about there being many rooms, enough room for everyone, I believed it with everything in me. I told him I loved him. I told him I had always loved him. I told him that the 14-year-old girl who had walked out of his house with $32 and a backpack and no plan at all, that girl had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she needed to survive. And survival had led her somewhere she never could have predicted. And now, at the end of everything, they were on the same side of the same door. That felt like grace. That felt like something only God could have arranged. He took his last breath just as the sky was beginning to go from black to gray, that particular shade that comes right before the first light, when everything is still, but you can feel the day gathering itself just out of sight. The room was very quiet. Pastor Samuel was there, and a nurse, and me. I kept holding his hand for a while after, because I wasn't ready to let go, and because there was nothing in that moment that required me to be anywhere else. I sat with him in the stillness, and I thanked God for every single phone call, every slow year of rebuilding, every moment we had been given that we almost didn't get. And I thought of a 14-year-old girl standing at a kitchen window breathing in the smell of jasmine before everything changed. And I thought, it was always moving toward this, even the hardest parts, even the parts that felt like nothing but breaking. They were always moving toward this room, this hand, this morning, this peace. If you've made it this far, if you've sat with this story from the beginning to the end, I want you to know something. I started sharing on this channel because I believe that stories like mine don't belong only to the people who live them. They belong to whoever needs them. And somewhere out there is a 14-year-old girl, or an 83-year-old man, or someone in between, who needs to hear that it is not too late, and you are not too far, and you are not too broken. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs it. Turn on the notifications so you don't miss the next story, because there are more of them, and every single one of them was moving through all its difficulty toward the same light. These stories are not mine to keep. They're meant to travel, to reach the person who is standing right now in a cold doorway, wondering if anyone inside will answer. Jesus answered, "He always does."